Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at two chapters from our African American Studies textbook. Specifically, we are looking at the chapter, it's chapter 2, Danny Glover, Memories from 1968, which is an interview with Jeanette R. Davidson and Danny Glover. And that starts on page 17. And then immediately after that, you will be looking at chapter 3, Pedagogy and Decolonization, Historical Reflections on Origins of Black Studies in the United States. And that is on page 26. This lecture will be a little short. There's going to be a supplemental video lecture to go with this by someone else as well that I think will be really useful. Let's talk about chapter 2 first, which is the Danny Glover Memories from 1968 interview. So first of all, as I'm saying, this is an interview. So keep that in mind that this is actually a small section of a much larger interview, and the author explains that that larger interview was published in 2010 in that edition of the textbook. And I think what this is really important is discussing the original strike that the students had in 1968 at San Francisco State University, in which the demand for Black studies was made. And it actually leads to a lot of other very big and important changes, but it all originated from the Black Student Union group. And this interview is really powerful because it gives you a first-person account or narrative of what happened. And you might notice as you're reading it as well that since it's an oral history, the facts and information might seem a little off or maybe more stream of consciousness, and it's because Danny Glover is remembering, and sometimes our memories they don't read the same way as, say, a historical textbook. And that's not to say that interviews and oral histories aren't very valuable and important. But what I do want to point out is that the author, Jeanette Davidson, does a really good job of having footnotes all over the place in this interview. So when Danny Glover mentions names or people or organizations, there could be a footnote. And if you go to the end of the chapter on page 24, you can notice, even in my version of the textbook, I don't know if you can see in the margins, but I was really highlighting a lot of the notes. And so I do want to encourage you, and this is something historians do a lot with the footnotes, is you should be double checking the notes if you don't understand what is being referenced, because there's a lot of valuable and important information there. So as you read this chapter, a big theme that comes out, and this is talked about in a really long response to the very first question of this section of the interview. The question is on page 17, and the response goes from page 18 through page 19, and it's one long paragraph. And it's the connection between the college and the community. And so at the very top of page 18, you can see that Danny Glover says, it's the second sentence, it was not only what happened with the students at San Francisco State, but what was happening in the community surrounding the area. And so what you should be getting out of this specific answer as he's talking and as you're reading it is the connection between the college and the community. They're not separate entities. They actually really impact each other. And here at our college, a community college, it's definitely a college for the community. And so over here on page 19 at the very top, the same response, that same question, he says, our motto was that whatever we were learning in college, our responsibility was to take it back to the community. And this is a very big point in various ethnic studies disciplines, including Black studies, is the connection between what you learn at college and your community. So I wanted to point that out with that response in particular. And so there's some really interesting comments made as you continue the interview. The author is makes a very good point about academics and the academy and kind of this elitist attitude at the bottom of page 20. You might have heard the term the ivory tower of education, and it's this notion that, there's certain points in which not everyone should be able to earn a degree. So everyone should be able to earn their bachelor's degree, but maybe a smaller percentage earn their master's, and even a smaller percentage earn their PhD. And those that do earn their PhDs, there could be this elitist attitude. So it's really interesting that the author, Dr. Davidson, points that out as a scholar who holds a PhD, right? And then on page 21, there's some important information in terms of the relationship with the Black Panther Party and the SNCC group, and how they affected or influenced what was going on at San Francisco State. And then it continues on with some discussions about the different types of textbooks that Danny Glover was reading while he was enrolled and participating in the Black Student Union and his classes there at San Francisco State during this time. And I think the key point at the end of page 22, in which he's talking about the relationship between students and the Black Panthers, is that there was a movement. The movement was for Black studies, but through different kinds of coalitions and alliances and groups, what ended up forming and evolving was also an ethnic studies program. So it's very fascinating to see the connections between these different fields of studies within ethnic studies. So I thought that was really powerful to point out. And I mean, the last thing, related to that is at the very end of the interview on page 24, right before you get to the key notes section. And that is the coalitions that occur. And he starts talking about Asian American Student Union, the La Raza Hispanic group. And he says, imagine what would have happened if we didn't have these coalitions with these groups. Would Black studies and then eventually ethnic studies have come about? And he even admits that the original group didn't really want to have these alliances at first. He describes it as, we did have the foresight, even though we were pulled, dragging and screaming into it, to realize that in order to make this strike more effective, and as it became more effective, as it became a headline, to be able to embrace these other ideas and embrace these coalitions. So he says, it's through the collective community amongst all, groups of color in this case, that big effective change was made. but he still points out because it began certainly not as a battle for ethnic studies, but it began solely in a very narrow way as a battle for Black studies. And I think that's the end of the segment of the interview that the author wanted to include. And it's just so key. It's so powerful because that is the truth. It began for Black students, the Black community, and it was the BSU at San Francisco State, and yet it also progressed into something larger. And so just really powerful. It's a powerful interview. I really hope you enjoy it. And I do want to point out in the notes that you should maybe look at notes 1, notes 2, and that's on page 24. And then over on page 25 of the notes, if you want to know who Nathan Hare was, because he's talked about a lot in the interview, that's note 11. And then note 13, which is the establishment of Asian American studies, Black studies, La Raza studies, Native American studies, in ethnic studies. It all began in 1968 through 1969, when students of the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front, staff and faculty, as well as members from our larger Bay Area community, organized and led a series of actions to protest systemic discrimination, lack of access, neglect, and misrepresentation misrepresentation of histories, cultures, and knowledge of Indigenous peoples and communities of color within the university's curricula and programs. And so this is, it's so, I don't know if it's easy to understand how grassroots and different the whole process was. Usually in academia, it's very much from the top down. Management controls all of these decisions. The state will mandate a certain curriculum. And in this case, it came from the bottom up, in which the students themselves, the faculty themselves, the community themselves said, we need this. We demand this, and management, make it happen. And it was just so powerful. Just an amazing history, and it's right here local, in our Bay Area. So I really hope you enjoyed that interview. The last chapter, which is chapter 3, starts on page 26. And I do want to be a little more quickly, go through this one really quickly since I spent so much time on the interview. I think the key idea to understand as you are learning about very specific contributions within Black studies and African American studies, James Baldwin's mentioned, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we have Malcolm X, of course, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael. So all these names are mentioned as a form of decolonization. And so as you're reading each of those smaller sections, what I want you to think about is, what does decolonization mean? Decolonization. So there is a definition here in the book, page 28, the top of that paragraph, it's labeled decolonization comes from. And so their description, the very first sentence, decolonization in theory is linked to furtherance of independence and freedom for a national body that once was colonized by another nation. To be decolonized implies full civil rights and full representation. And I want to take this even further. I do a lot of work with decolonial studies, the decolonial imaginary, decolonization. And I would like you to consider it a little differently than maybe even how they're describing it here. So colonization is the period in which one power takes over another power, another group, and colonizes them, in which they try to strip language, culture, often using the colonized people as a source of labor and income. That is colonization, colonial time periods, and then you get into something called post-colonial, which is this idea of colonization being over. There was a period in which Great Britain, for example, owned a lot of countries, a lot of peoples. They were big major colonizers, right? And then eventually a lot of these countries and peoples gained their freedoms and independence back. For example, India, right? And so people say, well, now it's post-colonial. It's after that colonial people period. However, decolonial means that, as described here in our chapter, that there's still issues that are apparent because of colonization. And so how can we move off of this trajectory that is more linear, in which we are progressing from colonial to post-colonial to decolonial? How can we undo the damages of colonization? And oftentimes with decolonial theory, we actually take the notion off into a third space, into a different state, a different way of thinking of being, because the traditional trajectory is often tied with Eurocentric, very heteronormative ideologies that are also very patriarchal. And so decolonial can oftentimes go off into a very different direction. And that's why it's associated with the decolonial imaginary. That's Emma Perez has done a lot of work on that. It's this notion of imagining almost a different type of future or a different type of being despite some of these historical positionalities, right? So it's a very complicated but very exciting form of theory. I highly recommend doing additional research if you are at all interested in decolonial theory, or if these sections in this chapter and the different theories and scholars that are described really make you want to learn more. So for instance, I highlighted in the section on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on decolonization as resisting oppression, the very last quote on page 30. He says, Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor will never voluntarily give freedom to the oppressed. Freedom is never given to anybody. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. It also says another thing. It reminds us of the fact that a nation or a people can break loose from oppression without violence. And I think that that quote is just so beautiful and poignant, and it has some important information about the need for struggle, the need for resistance, the need to demand what is owed, what is equitable. And so, and how can you do that without violence, right? Without having to use violence to escape oppression. So I think it's a really beautiful quote. I do want to also point out that in the Stokely-Carmichael section at the top of page 32, there's a discussion about how you have to unlearn. There's an unlearning process. And in fact, decolonial theory is oftentimes very tied up to an unlearning process, because in some of our traditional fields of study, you are taught that history should look like this, that these are the best types of sources, or these are the best types of scholars to study from, right? And part of it is this unlearning process. How can we think outside of a chronological time frame of reference in which we move from a past to a present to our future if we have been trained to think in a linear format? Can we consider alternate spaces, oftentimes referred to as third world spaces or third feminist spaces? What does that mean? And part of that is this unlearning process. And even as you are going through your college experiences, you might be unlearning things as well. For instance, if you went into a high school in which you were expected to sit, be quiet, always raise your hand, worry about finding the right answer and not questioning the answers or questioning the lectures, and now you're coming into a college space in which that is encouraged, in which you can push the boundaries because you are taking a more active role in your education. What does that unlearning process do to you as a person, as a scholar, as a community member? And so that's some of the stuff that's being talked about here. And I mean, I just really highlighted, this whole section practically on page 32 because it was just so powerful. And this notion of defining your own image and specifically defining what Black power is, and the connections with covert and overt racism. Covert being very specific, in which someone does something that you can easily point out as being racist. That is a racist thing to do. And overt racism, which is harder to identify and is often the systemic forms of racism. So I mean, like, that whole chapter or section on page 32 was just really powerful. So I'm going to, and of course, Angela Davis. She is just amazing, powerhouse in the field. And I did highlight one section from hers that I'd like to share, specifically at the bottom of page 33. To tell the truth, we had not really expected them, i.e. the administrative leadership and university overseers, to agree so readily to our notion of a college devoted to students who were not already privileged. As it turned out, as a result of negotiation, the name and some of the larger goals of the college in the original student proposal were jettisoned. And so I do like to point out that even though there is this idea that you might fail, that the structures of power that are put in place will keep holding on to that power, and yet through their work and their hardship and their truth, change occurred, and administration did start the Black Studies program at San Francisco State. I mean, just powerful information about Black scholarship here, about how Black scholarship has been minoritized in other fields of studies or often put in the margins, but yet this scholarship has always been there, and Black Studies brings it to the center and draws the attention that is so needed. So again, there's also notes on page 35, 36, and 37, which I highly recommend you look through. So if you have any questions about this lecture, just reach out via email. Thank you.